From Thermo Fisher Scientific, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. So this is our workshop on maintenance tips and tricks to help you keep your system up and running in the tip-top condition. We're joined today by Andrew Hill-Wilson, who is the Senior Manager in our Field Service Organisation, and Daniel Talbot from the UK and Ireland support team. So if any of you are familiar with these guys, you will know that they have got years and years of IT experience that they want to share with you this afternoon. If you have any questions at any time for Dan and Andrew, just use the Ask a Question box and we will answer as we go through the presentation. Okay, so Andrew and Dan, I'll hand it over to you guys.
Hi, thanks Gemma. Just to introduce myself first, so as Gemma said, my name's Dan Talbot. I'm an ion chromatography application specialist and I'm based in Hemel Hempstead here in the UK. You won't be seeing too much of me in the videos here, but basically I look after the labs and the instruments here in Hemel Hempstead. I've got a few years experience now of working as ion chromatography application specialist, and before that I was actually a service engineer as well. So I've been working quite closely with Andrew, who's our service manager, to put these videos together. So over to you, Andrew.
Hi, my name is Andrew Hill-Wilson. I was actually fully introduced myself in the video, but briefly, I'm the Senior Field Service Manager for the Unity Lab Services in the Chromatography and Mass Spec division of Thermo Fisher Scientific. We've got two videos to present to you today. The first one is going to address eluent issues, and after that, we'll take some questions around eluents and eluent quality and how to troubleshoot them. Second video will be addressing flow path and pressure issues, and again, after that video is completed, we'll take some questions regarding any problems you have regarding guard columns or pressure problems with your ion chromatograph. So make a start with our first video, which again addresses eluents and water quality issues. So take it away. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Andrew Hill-Wilson. I'm the Senior Field Service Manager for Unity Lab Services, CMD, which is Chromatography and Mass Spec division in the UK and Ireland. My background is been in ion chromatography. I started using IC in around about 1986 whilst working for the UK nuclear power industry, and then moved into personal care products for Beecham's before joining Dynix as a junior field service engineer in 1989. I've progressed up, becoming the IC specialist and then a team leader, field service manager, and now, just recently, I've been given the responsibility of the senior manager of Unity Lab Services. I'd like to introduce the instrument that we're going to be talking about today, which is the Thermo Scientific Dynix Aqueon unit. Now, we've got this one set up using a very, very simple carbonate chemistry and a set of AS9HC columns. So our eluent, which is contained in the bottle here, is very, very simple 9 millimolar sodium carbonate. The eluent goes through the instrument to this degasser, which just removes any excess gas from the eluent, and then travels down to our pump, a very, very simple serial pump here, through the pressure transducer, eventually hitting our load injection valve here. Now, the reason why we have a load injection valve is to introduce sample to the eluent stream. Our eluent and our sample travel through to the columns. Now, these are housed in an oven here, which keeps the temperature stable. And from the columns, they go into the suppressor. The suppressor is the heart of the ion chromatograph. Any anion or cation ion chromatograph would have a suppressor in there. It has three functions. The first function is to lower the background conductivity. And because it's lowered the background conductivity, we're also lowering the background noise, which gives us a much, much more stable baseline. Also, and one of the most important features of the suppressor is it enhances the signal. By changing the anions into their acid form, we get a significant increase in the response. We come out of the suppressor into our detector. It's a simple conductivity detector, which is again thermostated to make sure that we have consistent results. And we come out of our conductivity detector back into the suppressor. Now, what we're basically doing now is we're going to utilize that suppressed eluent, and we're going to put it back into the suppressor and apply an electrical charge to it, which causes electrolysis. That splits the hydrogen ion away, which we can then use to suppress the eluent coming through. So this suppressor is truly a self-regenerating suppressor. We come out of the suppressor, and we can see the bubbles. So the bubbles are good at this point. This is the only time in a chromatography system where we actually want to see bubbles. Usually they're quite bad, but here they're absolutely fantastic. And we can see the bubbles coming out. Those are the gases of electrolysis and the flows coming through, and it goes out to waste. On other systems that we produce, the Integrion and the ICS 6000, we use a technique called reagent-free ion chromatography, where we actually produce eluent within the instrument. Let me just show you the Integrion here. The waste of the suppressor is actually utilized in that process. So on the ICS 6000 Integrion, the eluent waste won't go to the suppressor waste won't go out to waste. It will actually be utilized in here. One of the major problems I had as a service engineer, or problems that we saw with customers, was with eluent quality. And that's really what we want to talk about today, is eluent quality. It still causes a lot of visits. A lot of service engineers have to go out to troubleshoot customers' eluent quality. And one of the biggest reasons why customers do have a problem with the eluent quality is the water quality that they're using. To successfully achieve good ion chromatography, you need 18.2 megohm water. Now that's the resistivity. Conductivity of less than 0.1 of a microsiemens. Now this is classed as class 1 or grade 1 water. It also needs to be filtered down to 0.2 of a micron. This is really, really important. Most laboratories will have a water purifier of some description that can supply water to that standard. Another option that we could do, if you had, is to use the IC Pure, which we have just here. Now the IC Pure can actually connect directly to an Integrion or an ICS 6000, and will actually supply water of exactly the right quality at exactly the right flow rate. So you can actually keep these systems going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without the risk of running out of any eluents or any buffers at all. And again, continually produces that water. So water quality. When it says 18.2 on the water purifier, it is delivering 18.2 water. But as soon as that water is manufactured, it will start absorbing carbon dioxide, and the quality of the water quite quickly deteriorates. So it is, again, quite important that when you are using your water from your purifier, you use it immediately. You don't put it into a carboy at the end of the laboratory bench and leave it there for a couple of days before you use it, because again, that will be absorbing gases from the environment and diminishing the quality of the water. One thing that we really, really want to avoid at all costs is bottled water. We really don't like that. Now, occasionally, it's okay, it's fine, but the problem with bottled water is exactly that. It's very, very much reliant on batch. At one point in its life, it probably was 18.2 megohm water. It was then put into a bottle. We have no idea what was in that bottle, whether the bottle was clean. And again, that will reduce the quality of the water. And then that bottle will be put onto a shelf or into a box and then delivered to you, where it will be put onto another shelf. So again, that bottle could be several days old or weeks or even months old before you actually come to use it. And again, it will be absorbing things through the glass, through the plastic. When you come to use it, you've opened the bottle, that has CO2 coming in. And so, although sometimes it works, we can't rely on it all the time. And we do see issues where a customer has been using bottled water successfully for a couple of weeks or even months, and then suddenly they stop being successful. And again, it can be down to the batches of the water. So we do recommend that you do invest in a water purifier if at all possible. One thing we definitely can't use, and we really just can't use this, is HPLC quality water. HPLC quality water, by definition, is designed for reverse phase HPLC. They don't really take any of the ions out of there. They take out any of the UV absorbing species, but it can be quite heavy in terms of ions or ionic contamination. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove the covers of this instrument so we can actually see some of the components, and we can take you through the components in a bit more detail. So if you bear with me, I'll just start removing the covers. Hi, I've now removed the cowling from the column so we can actually see the columns very, very clearly here. This is really, really important that you get to know your ion chromatograph, you get to know the flow and where the eluent is going. And to do that, if you've got that information, to troubleshoot the system just becomes that much easier. By knowing where the eluent should be going, you'll be able to identify any problems by obviously seeing where it's not going. So we can see here we're coming out of our injection valve, through our guard column, through the main column, into the suppressor, out of the suppressor into our cell, back out, into the suppressor, and out to waste, and you see the bubbles. Now the chemistry that we've got on this system today is a carbonate chemistry, so it's an anion carbonate chemistry. Very, very simple 9 millimolar sodium carbonate. The columns we're using are the AS9HC. So let's just explain that. AS stands for anion separator. AG will be anion guard. The 9 is because it's the 9th column that Dionex actually produced quite early on in the 90s, this one. The HC stands for high capacity. It's basically the column was designed for a bromate analysis in tap water. And as you're probably aware, tap water contains a lot of ions. So we had to really make sure we separated the chloride from the bromate. So that goes into the suppressor. Now, the suppressor takes the carbonate eluent, which has a background conductivity in the bottle here of around about 1,000 or so microsiemens, and reduces that background to 25 microsiemens. So if we have a quick look at our Chameleon screen, we can see here our background is there around about 25 microsiemens. The reason behind that is because we're taking the sodium carbonate, removing the sodium in the suppressor and adding a hydrogen ion, forming carbonic acid. And so that is the conductivity of the carbonic acid, as you know, a weakly dissociated acid. There are two conductivity readings here. The first one you can see at the top is the CD reading. Now that is the offset or the auto zero. So if anybody asks you what your background conductivity is, it's not that, because that is basically an offset figure. And if you haven't pressed the auto zero for a while, it might give you a false reading. The true reading of the wellness of your instruments is here in CD total. And you can see here 25 microsiemens, which is more or less what we're expecting for this eluent system. The other thing that we'll be looking at is to make sure the instrument is performing is the pressure. The pressure in this instrument is running around about 2,000 psi, and the important thing here, it's stable. It's not bouncing up and down by several hundred psi. Again, if you don't see a stable pressure, you won't see a stable baseline. If you don't have a stable pressure, more often than not, it's because you do have a bit of air in the pump. You just need to basically prime the pump out. So that's the basic chemistry. What we have at the moment, we've just done an injection. We can just see it finishing here. Let's have a look at the anatomy of this injection, of the chromatogram. The most important thing that I always think on an injection is this bit here. Now, this is the water dip. Everybody ignores the water dip, but it is very, very important. First off, if you don't get one, chances are you've not actually injected anything. It tells you that it gives you an idea of the dead volume of the instrument. How it's created is that once you've actually injected a sample, the sample is effectively deionized by the column. So what we see coming through here is deionized water, which has a conductivity of obviously less than 25 microsiemens. So we see a dip. Then we come out with our first peak, which is always on a carbonate system, fluoride. We might see things like formate and acetate in there as well. Our next peak will be chloride, then nitrite. This is, by the way, a 7 anion standard, followed by bromide, nitrate, phosphate, and finally sulfate. Now we call it phosphate, but it's not actually phosphate. Because of the pH of the eluent, it's actually orthophosphate, which is why it comes out just before the sulfate ion. Orthophosphate 2-, phosphate is 3-. If we change the eluent system on here to a hydroxide-based eluent, what we'd actually probably do is we see a totally different order of elution, but the last peak out will be the phosphate, which would come out around about here, depending on the concentration. So that's our system, successful chemistry. We've made our eluents using fresh water, 18.2 meg on water. I cannot emphasize how important that is for successful ion chromatography. So what we're going to do now is going to have a quiet break while I actually remake the eluent and see if we can see what any changes we can make by remaking the eluent for this instrument. So that's it for a minute. Thank you. So, hello. So I've just come in this morning. I've made up some new eluent, getting ready for the equipment to get some analysis done today. And I've just come back, and after the first injection, I'm looking at some of the chromatography, and the chromatography isn't looking quite right. And what we can see here straight away is that the fluoride peak is coming out slightly earlier than it was yesterday. So I'm starting to thinking, I'm wondering what could be wrong. So if we see a retention time shift, there are only 4 things that really can affect the retention time on the column of the system. The first thing is the actual flow rate that we've set the pump at. So we can see here it's set at 0.25. Are we sure it is actually pumping at 0.25? The next thing is the temperature. The next thing would be the column and the eluent. So we've got flow rate, column, temperature, and eluent. Those are the 4 things that are really going to be affecting your flow rate. So let's see if we can diagnose the problem without actually, well, just by looking at the chromatography and seeing what the chromatography is telling us. And we can see here now that the chloride peak is coming out way faster than it was coming out yesterday. So let's have a look at the chromatography. As I mentioned earlier, that one of the most important parts of the chromatography is the water dip. Now, the water dip basically is affected by 2 things. It's affected by the flow rate and affected by the dead volume of the system. When I mean the dead volume, I mean the volume between the injector and the detector. Now, I've not changed any of the tubing since this morning, so therefore I'm going to make a presumption that the dead volume is exactly the same, and the only difference then would be the flow rate. But the water dip is actually in exactly the same position, so therefore I can safely say that my pump is pumping at 0.25 mils a minute, and my dead volume is absolutely spot on. One thing it does tell me, though, is the water dip is significantly larger than it was on the previous injection. And why would that be? Well, up here, we can see that my background conductivity is actually 33.8, which is a lot higher than it was yesterday. Whereas, if you remember, it was about 22. So that's again another thing that's another clue into the mystery of why these retention times aren't quite the same. Column. Well, yeah, I could go out and buy a brand new set of columns and see if that was the case. But everything here is telling me with the background conductivity that my eluent is possibly the one that's at fault. So that is really where I would actually go. So we've made that diagnosis literally from just looking at the chemistry itself, the chromatography. And I would say the most important part here is the water dip. Now, if you are ever concerned about your chemistry and you're running an application which is a bit away from the standard application from the column, every single column comes with a test chromatogram. And we can see the test chromatogram here for the AS9HC. Now, on the test chromatogram, we can see that the retention time for the last peak sulfate is around about the 21-minute mark. Now, on our column, it's coming out slightly faster. Also, remember that test chromatogram isn't produced with a guard column, and the guard column could add around about 10% onto those retention times. So our column here that we were using is slightly worn, but the order of elution is right, and we're in the same sort of ballpark. If you are concerned about your column, my recommendation would be to actually go and recreate your test chromatogram. And if you can recreate the test chromatogram again, you will really confirm that the column itself is in good working order. So your test chromatogram is very important. Make sure they are kept. The other thing about the test chromatogram is it gives you the back pressure of that particular column at the time of manufacture. We can see on this column it came in around about the 1500 psi mark or thereabouts. Remember what I was saying regarding the guard column. The guard column gives you roughly a quarter to a third of the pressure. So add the guard column onto that 1500, and as you can see within Chromeleon, we're getting about the right back pressure here, about 2000 psi. So that again gives us a really good indicator that there is absolutely probably nothing wrong with the column in terms of pressure. There's nothing wrong with the flow rate. Although we have got the column open, we know that the temperature is stable, certainly stable in this room. Therefore, we're left with only one thing left that it could be that's causing our problem, which is the eluent. And in actual fact, this eluent is 18 millimolar carbonate. I've double strength the eluent just for the demonstration. And it's something that we can do. I'm sure everybody has done this. You've added the carbonate to your volumetric. You've gone away, have a cup of tea, come back. Did I actually add that carbonate there? I don't know, can't remember. And you end up making a double strength eluent by accident. So again, what this has proved that you can actually identify what you've done just by looking at the picture that the iChromatograph has showed you, and you can very quickly then go make up the new eluent and double check it. If you're still unsure about the eluent quality, go back to first principles very quickly. And one thing that we used to do is, if you really are unsure about the concentrates that you've got or anything, fill the bottle with your good quality water, use dry weight chemicals, calculate exactly how much you should be adding in, and make the eluents from first principles. And that's a really simple way of making sure that there hasn't been an error with any concentrates that you've made or any contaminated glassware that you might have used. Again, glassware, very important in ion chromatography, that you keep dedicated glassware for your ion IC. We don't want anybody doing acid digests in your volumetrics and then putting them back on the shelf. So dedicate your glassware, dedicate your chemicals, good quality water, and the IC will perform for you reliably. So that really completes the story regarding eluents, and I'm going to go now and busily remake up my eluent again and try and get the system to give me some better chromatography. So thank you very much. I hope you found that useful, and look forward to seeing you in my next presentation, which will be around tubings and fittings and flow paths and back pressures. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so useful to see the steps that you take to troubleshoot just a simple change in a chromatogram. Really useful. Thank you very much. We have got some questions in, so I will start with those. And for anybody listening, please do send in your questions using the question box. So the first up, you talked a little bit about background concentration. What's a typical background concentration that somebody should be looking for and monitoring changes?
So for a carbonate eluent or carbonate or bicarbonate-based buffer, you'd be looking somewhere between 20 to 30 microsiemens, because the product of the suppressor is carbonic acid, and that's roughly where you should be. If you go down to the hydroxide-based buffers, that's from the RFIC, you should be looking at a background of less than 1 microsiemen because the product from the suppressor should be pure water. And the same really goes to cations as well. The element using for cations is invariably methane sulfonic acid or sulfuric acid, and again that will produce water as the suppressor. So again, looking for a background of less than 1 microsiemen. Now, one thing I will emphasise though is don't get too hooked up on the numbers. Really focus on your picture, focus on your chemistry, focus on your chromatography. If your chromatography looks good and the background is maybe slightly higher than it should be, great, fantastic. The problem that we do see is customers having absolutely fantastic chemistry, but the background is 0.1, 0.2 microsiemens higher than they had yesterday, and next thing we know, we've got a telephone call. So it is focus on the picture, focus on the results, then let the KPIs, let the numbers, use the numbers as a troubleshooting guide. If something actually then goes wrong, they will guide you to what is actually wrong, but it's the picture that you should be looking at primarily.
Yeah, I think just to add maybe from the application side as well, one of the things we often advise is also just to really look for trends. So when your system was installed and you first set that application up, make a note of where that chromatogram was when you first run a standard, when everything was new and it was you first developed the application. So you've got something to kind of compare to, because as Andrew said, things will vary a bit, over time. But if you've got something to always sort of refer back to, so you've got a benchmark. And often when we get questions on the application side saying there's a problem with their chemistry, often we'll say, okay, it's not looking great now. Can you show us how it looked when, before your problem started? So if you've got that to refer back to, that's really useful as well.
So as well as, because Andrew mentioned the test chromatogram, so, you've got that to reference, but actually you've got your own test chromatogram that you produced on your system when you first ran it. So keep that as a reference point.
Absolutely.
And is this something that should be done routinely, not just when there's a problem? Should we be checking kind of test conditions on a regular basis?
Well, I think every time you run your chromatograph, you'll be doing a standard of some description, maybe a mid-range standard. Something that, again, I used to do while I was an engineer. I used to be running what we call then a query within 7.3. It's called something different, and you can query that one chromatogram for the lifetime of the instrument on that data vault, and then you can trend those results as they came through. So you can trend the retention times. You can importantly trend the peak height, and that again is a really powerful troubleshooting tool that you'll find within Chromeleon. People don't realise, they think it's there for other reasons, but as an engineer, it was the most useful part of the system, because once you overlaid all those plots, you'll find the outlier. And when you find the outlier, you know the day that the instrument went wrong. And then you go through the audit trail on that day and you'll find something happened that day. And again, it's very simple tool to use. You don't need to have a service engineer on site to do that. You've got all that information in the computer within Chromeleon, within your iChromatograph, to tell you that already. So,
absolutely, thank you. So I think one of the key takeaway messages from that video was water quality is absolutely critical. That was definitely the message that I got from there. But what happens if, somebody's water purifier breaks and they've got work they need to do and they need to use bottled water in an emergency? What are they expected to see in their chromatography?
Well, the first thing is to make sure that the bottled water that you're purchasing actually has got a specification on the side of it. So at least at some point in its life, it was 18.2 megon water. That's the first thing. There are certain chemistries will benefit, but will cope with it better than other chemistries. For instance, the carbonate chemistry is quite a robust chemistry, and that possibly will cope with it better than, let's say, a hydroxide chemistry. You will see, or possibly will see, an increased background conductivity. You might see some extra peaks kicking around in there as well. Chances are it'll be okay for you, but the problem is, what you don't know is when you open the next bottle, whether that will be okay, or the next bottle, or the next bottle. So I'm not going to say it's quite as bad as Russian roulette, but you just don't have that reliability, that comfort of having your own water purifier where it's actually manufactured on site, day on day, properly serviced, so you know full well you're getting 18.2 meg on water.
Yeah, exactly. So one thing that wasn't mentioned in the video, but sometimes you have the filters in the bottom of the Eluent bottle. Is there anything that people need to be aware of with those, regular changing or anything to look out for?
Yeah, really good point now, Gemma. The filters there are really they're quite a coarse filter, and they're really there just to take out any precipitation and any undissolved carbonate that you've got in the bottle, and anything else that might have actually dropped into the bottle as you're making it. It is really important when you're using a carbonate buffer that you change those very, very regularly. Now, I remember one system I went to see in Liverpool, in the northwest of England, and the customer again hadn't changed them for a while, couldn't quite work out what was going wrong, looked into the bottle and the filters had turned green. The sunlight had come in, carbonate, a fantastic bud growth media, and you looked inside and you got a real problem there. So yeah, use the inline filters, but make sure they are changed very, very regularly and cleaned or replaced. So do keep an eye on them. We do see issues with inline filters that haven't been maintained properly.
Okay, thank you. And then I think this is the last question for Eluent. Just talk to us a little bit about topping up of Eluent. So you're getting close to the bottom, but you've not finished. Should you be doing this? What?
Yeah, good one again. When it was Dynex at the time introduced RFIC, the catchphrase was just add water, and nobody realised how complicated just adding water would actually be. So what we would find were people the Eluents were going down to the bottom, and then they were basically topping up the Eluents. But the problem is that, as I mentioned, certainly in water and certainly in carbonate Eluents, it's a fantastic bud growth media. And those bugs are growing, and all you're doing is adding more food to them. They just grow bigger. And in the end, by the time it gets to a couple of weeks later, there can be all sorts of things evolving in your Eluent bottle. Now, what that basically will manifest itself is that Eluent, or those bugs, that bacteria, will go into the Eluent stream. It'll hit some of the capillaries in there and cause massive pressure issues. The main place we see them is on, if we've got Aquion ICS 6000, we'll see the gradient mixer blocking up first of all, and we can also see it around the Eluent generator degasser modules as well. They can cause problems. So when you get into the bottom of your Eluent, maybe every week, just stop the system, take the bottle off, wash it down. We sometimes use a small amount of methanol just to swirl it around and wash the bottle out. But the main thing to do is don't just keep topping up the water day after day after day. You will eventually run into serious problems. And so make sure those Eluent bottles are washed down regularly.
Yeah, just one of the things that we often say when we're training new users is just to make sure, as Andrew said, maybe a minimum of weekly. So we often sort of encourage people to say, just have a routine where maybe it's on a Monday morning, regardless of what's happened with the system, maybe it's used a bit intermittently, but try and make sure that any water or any water for the Eluent or even the wash bottle for the auto sampler, just make sure there's a certain time of the week where it gets replaced. The bottles all get rinsed out and replaced once a week, so you have that routine. It never ends up sitting there for too long, and that kind of helps. That routine helps to stop that sort of thing from happening.
Wonderful, thank you. So there's no more questions, but everyone listening, if you've got questions, please do keep them coming in, and I think we can move on to the next session now.
Okay.
Hi, it's Andrew Hill-Wilson again for the second presentation in our for the IC Symposium. So what we're going to be doing today is looking on how to troubleshoot pressure issues around your Dynex, Aquion or any other ion chromatograph. Come to that. Now, Previously, in the first presentation, we were talking about eluent quality and the effects of having a poor eluent can have on your chemistry. And we re-established the chemistry by making up the eluent correctly, making it as 9 millimolar rather than the 18 millimolar carbonate. Now, what's happened now is we've put the system back on again, and suddenly our back pressure has risen. It was running previously at 2,000 psi. Today, as you can see, it's running at around about 2,500 psi here, which means we've gained 500 psi. So what we need to be able to do is to actually diagnose where that back pressure is actually coming from, and we can do that very, very simply. All we basically need is an understanding of the flow path of your ion chromatograph. Now, as I talked to you yesterday, I mentioned our eluent comes in through the degasser, and from the degasser, it goes straight to the pump. The pump pumps it at high pressure, but it meets this device here. Now, this device is called a pressure transducer. Now, the pressure transducer is an electronic device that registers how much pressure is in the system and sends an electrical signal, through to the electronics in here, through to Chameleon, and that's where that number is read out there, 2,493. So any pressure before the transducer is not relevant, but pressure after the transducer is relevant. So what we need to do is to find out where this back pressure is coming from, and we can use the transducer as a diagnostic tool. So the first thing I'm going to do is to switch the pump off. I'm going to let the pressure die away. What we're going to be doing now is disconnecting component by component along the flow path of the instrument until we come to a component which is giving us more back pressure than we would expect it to give, and that will be the root cause of our problem. So from the pressure transducer, we go in on the ACU, we go into a small pulse dampener, and we come out of the pulse dampener through this green piece of tubing into a load injection valve. So what I'm going to do is very carefully undo the fitting into the injection valve. Very carefully. These are PEEK fittings, so a bit of care is needed to make sure we don't damage them. Out it comes, and there it is. Now, we've got 9 millimolar of carbonate in water here, so it is quite an innocuous eluent. So I'm just going to put a piece of tissue underneath there. I'm going to switch the pump on. And with the pump switched on, we'll just wait for the pressure to build, and let's see what it gives us. So we look at our Chameleon panel. The pressure is building, 15 psi. Effectively nothing. Now that's told us two things. First thing it's told us is there's not a back pressure issue on the pulse dampener. Fantastic. Also, more importantly, it's told us that the pressure transducer is working correctly. For instance, if I'd have disconnected that and my pressure the pressure reading was still several thousand, and I disconnected at the transducer, it would indicate that we might have a pressure transducer issue. Very, very rare, not common at all, but again, something that we could look at. So there we go, 20 psi, switch the pump off. I'm now going to reconnect the fitting back to the valve. We're going to talk about fittings later on in this presentation and how best to use them and how best to treat them. I'm now going to undo the fitting coming out of the valve to the column set and switch the pump back on again. This is going to test the back pressure of the pulse dampener connected to the load injection valve. And we can see the pressure slowly but surely building up. The load injection valve should give us absolutely no back pressure, or very, very little, maybe 1, maybe 2 psi at most. And as you can see, nothing. Very, very little indeed, which is great, making sure we collect any drips of our eluent, switch the pump off, and then I'm going to reconnect the fitting. Again, being very, very careful with the fitting. And we're then going to go to our column set. So again, take the fitting out. You notice I'm not going to go test the guard column straight away, and I'm testing the fitting and the piece of tubing. The tubing that's used within 2mm systems is around about 5/1000th of an inch internal diameter. So if the system has been left overnight, not been rinsed down or been left for a long period of time, it is possible to actually get a precipitation into the tubing, which can cause an inclusion or a blockage. And we can see here that it is a very, very narrow bore piece of tubing, and we can see that it has actually upped the pressure very, very slightly by about 10 psi, which in the grand scheme of things is not an awful lot. So we know that this fitting is absolutely fine and the tubing is absolutely fine. What I'm going to do now, and I can do this while the pump's actually still flowing, is introduce the guard column. There we go. And we'll watch the pressure build. Now then, what should be the back pressure of your guard column? There is no test chromatogram that comes with a guard column. You can read it in the instruction manuals. But basically, a good guide is the test chromatogram that comes with the analytical column, this one here. The back pressure of a guard column is around about a third, maybe a quarter of the back pressure of your separator column. Now, if you remember on presentation 1, we looked at the test chromatogram of this column, and we know that it should be around about the 1500 psi. So what I would be expecting for this column would be maybe 400 to 500 psi. So have a quick look at Chromeleon. Let's see what we're getting out of it. Aha! 900 psi. So I think we found ourselves our problem there. We found 500 psi of excess back pressure. So again, I'm going to switch off the pump, and there we go. Now then, this is our column. The column has what's called a bed support, top and bottom. They're called bed supports because we're dealing with ion exchange chromatography. An ion exchange resin, it's almost like a definition or a tradition. We have a bed or an ion exchange resin bed. So these are called bed supports. If this was a HPLC column or reverse phase HPLC column, you'd be referring to them as Fritz. But the things are exactly the same. They're 0.2 micron filters, top and bottom, which just basically keeps the resin in place. But they will also stop any particulates coming through the column. Of course, there shouldn't be any particulates because all our samples, as we know, will be filtered down to 0.2 micron, and our eluents are also filtered down to 0.2 micron. But we live in the real world and things do happen. You could look at this as a very, very expensive filter. Now, what we need to do now is we know this column has got a blockage. The very, very strong chance the blockage is in the top bed support. This is where the sample and the eluent hits first. This is where it will block. If it gets through this one, it'll get through that one. So it's this one here that's going to see all the action, so to speak. So what we do is we can take the bed support out. Very, very simple to do. And in fact, with each column, you'll get 2 bed supports. But you do need to be quite careful with it. So a spanner there, a spanner here, and undo the top of the column, and the bed support will drop out. Now, sometimes it can be a bit awkward, sometimes you do need to be tapping, so in true Blue Peter tradition, I have another one. So again, the bed support will just come out, put the new one in, and here's one I prepared earlier, and we'll pop this one back on. Do be careful about changing bed supports. Again, prevention is better than cure. If we can filter our samples, if we can filter our eluents, we won't need to do this. I'm going to put the column back on, and then I am actually going to just carry on pressure checking the instrument for just for completeness, just to make sure there isn't anything else happening. I'll switch the pump back on. And while that's building up, I just want to talk to you about the pressure around the suppressor. One of the one of the conversations we do have a lot of customers is they see problems around the suppressor area around here, and we can say to the customer, oh, you've got too much back pressure, and the customer will say, we haven't, because the back pressure is identical to where it's always been. And the reason why that is because as the eluent runs through the column, we see a massive pressure drop off. So although the pressure here is probably 2000 psi, by the time we get to the end here, it's effectively atmospheric pressure 10, 20, 30 psi. Any back pressure that we see post suppressor won't be registered here, because the suppressor itself will act as a relief valve and release that pressure, and that again can cause us issues. Now that seems to be working nicely. The pressure will build up very, very slowly on this, with it being a 2mm system. So I'm just going to pop that back very, very quickly and talk to you about the suppressor. I'll turn the suppressor on, because obviously it's being turned off because the pump keeps going on and off. And one thing I want to just pop that back is one of the more, it's not sort of a common fault, but it's something that we do see. We got the suppressor switched on, and we can see bubbles coming out of the suppressor, and we can see the pressure building up on our pump here. Again, 2 mils, it's going to be quite slow, but we can see bubbles coming out. One of the issues that we have seen relatively frequently is customers who have got very, very high background conductivity or very, very low background conductivity. The pressure is absolutely bob on, exactly where it should be, but they don't see any chromatography. But we are still seeing bubbles coming out of there. And one of the reasons why this could happen is that the tubing around the suppressor into the cell and out of the suppressor back into out of the cell back into the suppressor has got included, has got blocked. And a really, really quick way to see if that is causing you the issue is take this fitting off very, very briefly. Now what I'm going to do is, you can see these bubbles moving here. If this tubing is blocked, what's happening is the eluent is coming in and coming straight out, and actually bypassing the cell. It's just coming in and straight out. So if that is the case, when I take this fitting off, these bubbles will carry on moving. And the bubbles have stopped, which is great news, because as expected, there is actually nothing wrong with this instrument. But if those bubbles were to carry on moving, that means we've got a problem around the tubing around the suppressor. And the best thing to do there is to replace the tubing, and then start all over again. So it really is very, very simple. So what we'll do, what we'll go on to now is we're going to talk about fittings, we're going to talk about different bits of tubing and where you would use the tubing and different types of fittings that you can use. But what we've got now is the pressure coming back to where we were. We've saved ourselves a lot of trouble. We've saved ourselves an engineer's visit. We've troubleshooted the system using basically the spanner and the pressure transducer which are provided with the instrument. So we'll come back to you in a minute regarding tubing. Right, so what we're going to just talk about now is the actual fittings and the actual tubing which are used on the Dynamics Acuion system. Now, you probably noticed that when I was fitting columns backwards and forwards a minute ago when we were doing the pressure checking, I was actually very, very careful on how I positioned the tubing and the ferrules. And just let me explain why I was doing that. So let me just undo the guard column just to demonstrate and just make it a bit easier for us to see. What we have with the system, we have a fitting and we have a ferrule there. And I don't know if you can just about see, you can probably just see a small piece of tubing coming out of that ferrule. Now that really, really is important. And the reason is that the way we fit into the column, the way we would always do it, is we would get the column and we would make sure there is plenty of tubing coming out outside the ferrule, and then we would introduce the fitting and the tubing and then push the fitting down and screw it down. Now, what is really important here is the screw or the fitting which is pushing the ferrule down to actually hold the piece of tubing in place. If we have a quick look at what that looks like in close-up, so we can actually see what it should look like. What we're looking at here is a piece of tubing coming out, and that's perfect. Now, it is actually the tubing that's making the seal. It's not the ferrule that's making the seal. The ferrule is only holding the tube in place. That's all it's doing. If we don't do it that way and the ferrule slips forward as the piece of the fitting on the higher piece of tubing, what will happen is it'll be the ferrule which is into the column, and that will going to cause dead volume or a disturbance, and that's going to cause you band broadening or peak fronting or peak tailing. What is also important is that these fittings are, for the majority, finger tight, and you notice that to put them in, I've literally just been doing that, bit of a tweak, and off we go. If you are finding that you're using a spanner to undo them or a spanner to spanner them down right the way in, it's because the fitting is damaged. Now, if we have a damaged fitting, you run the risk of breaking the fitting as it comes out. And if you do break the fitting as it comes out, there's no guarantee we're going to be able to replace what it's broken into. So we could end up with a new column, we could end up with a new stator, we could end up with a brand new pump head. So there's some very, very expensive repairs on there for the sake of what is effectively a £1 fitting. So if you are doing checking some of the fittings around your instrument, do make sure that they just go in and out very, very simply. Maybe use a spanner for the very, very last tweak, and really it is just a tweak. We don't need to really hammer these down at all to make the fittings. So we've looked at the tubings and we've looked at the fittings. Now, the tubings themselves don't last forever, and we will have to replace them at some point. They might become worn, or they might become brittle, or you might just need to change them out. Now, changing the tubing, you will need to use a tubing cutter. The tubing itself can be purchased from our spares team, or you will have some of your ship kits from the original installation. So get the tubing cutter. Temptation is just to clip it down. Now that might work some of the time, but you do run the risk of just crushing the internal diameter, the internal volume of that. So the right way to do it is to put it in and spin it round, take it out, and then just quick snap, and that will give you a very, very clean break. That is the correct way to use a tubing cutter. What I would also do now is, before you attach anything to that end, pressure test it exactly the way we've just done that to the system. Connect it in and make sure it doesn't contribute significantly to the actual back pressure. What we have on camera in a minute is some really poor examples of badly cut tubing. Now, this is tubing which is cut with effectively a pair of scissors. As an engineer, we have on occasions gone out to customer sites who have actually basically not used their tubing cutters and have used basically scissors to cut the tubing. Now, what you can see there is diagonal cuts, rough cuts. That tube will not give you a good fitting. Remember, it's not the ferrule that seals the tube. It's the tube into the actual column that does the seal. The ferrule, all it does is keep it in place. Right, so back to the instrument now, and let's have a quick look at the tubings that we have. You can see here there are all sorts of different colours of tubing, and it really is important that you use that tubing in exactly the right place. So let me just go through the tubing colours that we do have and where we should put them. So we've got some examples of tubing just laid out, and let's just have a quick look at them. So there they are. We've got our red tubing. The red tubing and the black tubing is used predominantly for the chromatography side of the instrument, which is basically anything after the load injection valve. So anything between the load injection valve, the columns, the suppressor, and the cell. This basically cuts down on the amount of dead volume on the system and gets our peaks nice and sharp. So that's 5/1000th of an inch and 10/1000th of an inch. The next tubing is blue. The blue tubing is about 15/1000th of an inch, and you'll only actually really see it in one place. And we tend to see it on the ASAP autosample on the divert valve. The next tubing is the orange tubing. That's 20 thou in internal diameter, 20/1000th of an inch. Now, we use that for sample loops. So something like a 25-50 microliter sample loop will probably be made out of orange tubing. So we use it when dead volume isn't important, but we just need a bit more volume in the tubing. And then finally we go into green. Now a green tubing is used in two places. One, it's used for very high volume injection loops, 100 microliter, 200 plus injection loop volumes. But it's also used, and we've just cut back to the instrument now, it's also used here, and you'll see it in drain tubing and tubing where we just need to, where dead volume just really isn't important. So for instance, I've used it here for the injection port, and we've used it here in terms of getting the waste sample away from the instrument. Now, the tubing and ferrules and fittings do cause problems, and one really quick way of avoiding that is to move over to a recent innovation, which is our Viper fittings. Now, our LC customers have been using Vipers for quite a few years now, very successfully, and it's only really in the last couple of years that we've actually managed to get these actually onto our IC product range. They've been long waited for. Our customers who are fortunate enough to have the Integrium and the ICS 6000 will have already seen this technology and will already be enjoying it. But there is actually no reason why we can't use this technology onto our Aquin unit, and we'll basically get away from tubings and ferrules and everything around that. So that concludes the second presentation for the symposium. Thank you very much for listening. I really hope you found some of the bits and pieces that we've talked about useful, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was so useful, and especially to hear it coming from an engineer's perspective. So I hope everybody's gained some valuable tips. We did get some questions in, but actually they were answered towards the end of the presentation, which was around tubing colours and pressure. So thank you for that. If we haven't got around to answering your question, we will do that via email afterwards. So a very big thank you to Andrew and Dan for putting that material together for us. And thank you everybody for your attention.